Tell me when.
Romy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I'm so happy to be here and get the chance to speak with you today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to everything that will be popping up. The topic we have chosen for today is psychological safety. And I am intrigued and curious. And we always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Yes, so it's a very good question. It actually took me quite a long time to call myself a facilitator. You know, I've been doing this work for now over a decade. Well, I'd say that I came into facilitation through the training space. And so I was even hesitant for many years to call myself a trainer because I felt, oh, I'm still learning. And to really call myself means I must be an expert in this field. And luckily, I've learned about failing forward, right, in this space, and how important it is to, there really is no such. I don't believe anymore that this concept of an expert even exists, and everyone is learning and growing in the space. And I remember going to a training of trainers back in 2015, I think it was, and saying, okay, I've been doing this already for a while, but I don't call myself a trainer. And finally, they said, I think you need to start living in this space and feeling more confident and be able to call yourself a trainer, because what you're doing is training. And through that led me actually eventually to study with the Institute for Experiential Learning. And one of the aspects that I love that David Kolb, who's one of the head creators of experiential learning, he has a great model, which for me really resonated, that helped me see that he calls it the educator role. But for me, I think about it as the training role, that you're really adopting so many roles in one. And part of that is, being a facilitator, being a subject matter expert, being a evaluator and standard setter to evaluate your trainings, as well as a coach to ensure that your participants actually go forward and implement what they've learned. And so through that model is really when I said, okay, what I'm in the greater umbrella, I call myself a trainer, but underneath this umbrella, I'm always moving through these different modes, and adopting this facilitation aspect is a key part of it. So I am a facilitator. I do call myself a facilitator, but I'd say that my main umbrella, I'd say, is a trainer, because I need to keep all of it in mind to create a holistic learning experience.
Thank you. And what comes up for me when I listen to you is the distinction of what we do and to what extent it becomes a label that we apply to ourselves. So yes, I do training. Would I call myself a trainer? Yes, I do facilitate. Am I a facilitator? And then this entire imposter thingy coming up, right?
Totally.
I was speaking with a friend the other day that it's also kind of almost a women's issue, that, oh, can I put this label on myself? Am I actually good enough? Have I arrived yet? And men seem to have less of this issue.
Yes, it reminds me of the differences between how men and women apply for jobs. And women often don't. The statistics show that women often don't apply for jobs until they reach 100% of the criteria or qualifications, whereas men are much more willing to apply even if they only reach 70 or 80% of those. And I think there's a connection there. I think luckily now I've really made this a full-time aspect of my work. Now I'm very proud and confident to call myself a learning experience designer, a trainer, a facilitator, because this is really what I'm doing at the core. But it did take me quite a bit of time to feel that confidence, and so glad I got over that hump eventually.
Yeah. It somehow also feels like a commitment to a role, to fully embrace it, while also acknowledging that we are all still learning, and it's also about the inner journey, right? So how do we develop our own skills, our own mindset in order to bring this to the space? And Since we discussed that we'll talk about psychological safety, I'd be curious to know how the concept or the idea of what it is has changed for you over the years, and maybe also in the different roles. So what does psychological safety mean for you when you're more in the role of a trainer versus a facilitator or a coach?
Mm. Yeah, from very early on, when I started training, facilitating, I always knew that I wasn't calling it psychological safety, but I remember saying like we need to create a safe space, a safe space.
Mm,
And so it was always on my radar in some aspect, but I really didn't understand in the way that I do now how essential it is. I really believe that psychological safety is the foundation for learning. It's a key building block that if you don't have that, you can't even advance to the learning phase, and you can't really start to, facilitate learning spaces or provide content. And so I do remember quite early on trying to sneak in some aspects in the beginning saying, okay, this is a safe space, this is a safe space. And over time I've learned that you don't want to say it's a safe space. People need to see it. They don't care how much you say it. They need to see it to believe it. And that comes so much more in terms of the behaviors, the practices, the way you design your training, the support you give. And so, yes, when I think about all these different roles of a trainer, for me, psychological safety is key in order to facilitate the space. But as a facilitator, it's so much about um, setting the stage for psychological safety.
mm,
How are you, before you do anything, before you even start, encouraging conversations and people discussing, you need to really create the space for psychological safety to bloom, because otherwise people will not be there and able to contribute their ideas, their honest opinions, share their questions, because many people hold back their questions thinking, oh no, this is a stupid question, I don't want to ask, right? And you can say, oh, this is a safe space and there's no such thing as stupid questions. But it's more, for me, what I've learned over time, it's not about what you say, but so much more about what you do and how you hold that space in any of those four roles, really.
mm. And it's funny, it reminds me of when we say, oh, just relax, it's going to be fine. And what happens as we tense, right? The more often we hear, just relax, just relax. It's like being at the dentist. Oh, you can relax, it won't hurt. We don't believe it until we feel it. And
Absolutely.
especially learning is vulnerable because we have to admit that we don't know something. And if we don't feel safe, our brain is just not ready to absorb anything that is kind of new or puts us in a space where we are vulnerable. Yeah.
And I think it's learning is vulnerable on all sides, right? Learning is a partnership. And I think oftentimes we forget that I, as a trainer, facilitator, I can create the space or create a space that's conducive for psychological safety. I can hold the space for learning. But at the end of the day, it's a partnership because it's also up to the participants. If no matter how incredible your workshop is, no matter how, the activities that you're doing, no matter how you're role modeling these behaviors, if the participants are not in the mindset to learn, and if they're showing up more as critics or
Mhm.
consumers instead of collaborators and contributors, right, then a learning can occur. And when you think about vulnerability, I always think about it in both sides. It's vulnerable for participants to speak up, to show up authentically, to admit when they don't know. But it also requires the facilitator to be able to say, hey, to also show up with vulnerability, to
Mm.
also admit when they make mistakes, to also, um, you know, share vulnerably and role model vulnerability so that participants feel more comfortable to do the same. And so I'm always thinking about those dynamics in the partnership lens of learning is vulnerable, as you said. And if learning is vulnerable to risk, we need to emphasize even more psychological safety so that people feel comfortable to step outside their comfort zone and step into that vulnerability in order to learn.
Yeah. And it almost sounds as if we first have to build the psychological safety for ourselves so that we are ready to step into this vulnerable space.
It's so true. And this is something that's really shifted for me over time. Like when I think back to some of my first workshops, where now I laugh because it's like, oh wow, I really did not know what I was doing. But I was coming at it from a place of fear and a place of, if I'm the one holding the space, I have to be the most knowledgeable person in this room. And what's going to happen if a participant asks me a question and I don't know the answer? It was so much more about me knowing versus me being that facilitator, right? And so over time, I've learned how to show up, and as you said, even create safe space for myself, how to show up and address those situations when someone asks a question. And it's totally and completely okay to say, I don't know. That's a fabulous question. And I don't know why. I'm going to actually, one time we were in person, I said, hey, we're going to have a break coming up. Why don't we both actually look into this further and let's research a little bit together to find the answer to that question. Or sometimes if it's online, I say, that's a great question. I don't know it. I'm going to go do some more research and I'll come back to you. And this is something we can explore together. And I think that shift was such a relief and a weight off my shoulders of saying, I don't have to come in here from the aspect of being the expert. I'm here as an explorer and really being able to create the space for others to explore these topics with me.
And I'd be curious, how did you get there? Was it an experience, or was it something that you read and then created courage enough to do and then found out, oh, actually, this works. I didn't die. I can do this more often.
Also trying to think, where and how did those shifts happen? I think it was a combination of both. One, witnessing some other fabulous facilitators and trainers who showed up in that same aspect with vulnerability and ability to admit their mistakes in front of a group or laugh at themselves. Or I think that was something, I always remember what people say about leaders, and I always say facilitators are leaders, trainers and facilitators are leaders, that people learn more from what the leaders do than what the leaders say, right? And so I've had a lot of wonderful mentors and in my life, and witnessing how they interact with these topics. But moreover than that, I think just over time being able to really dive in this space. For many years, one of the top topics that I was training in was emotional intelligence, and learning more about how absolutely key vulnerability is in terms of all these areas. I realized I had to walk the talk, right? I cannot say, oh, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, connection, joy, belonging, learning. It's, a requirement for psychological safety, all these things, if I was not willing to be vulnerable myself. And it's so crazy because I think, unfortunately, we still see too much, particularly with corporate workshops, but just in general, still, I find that too many people equate vulnerability with weakness, and especially in that training space. And so, right, you should be the sage on the stage, and you should be the one who knows everything and keeps your own composure. But at the end of the day, if I've learned that my openness to vulnerability, my willingness to show up authentically, is actually become my superpower as a facilitator and a trainer. And it creates the conditions for everyone else to do the same. And I find that after trainings, I have so many participants who say to me, it's, oh, we love the learning, we love the content of this, but wow, thank you so much, because the way that you show up, step into your own comfort zone, the way uncomfort zone, the way that you embrace your full self, and you're willing to show and expose the good, the bad, the ugly, that's what really resonated. And even when I used to do training of trainers workshops, and I still do, some of the key learnings that participants would take away is, wow, I really appreciated how you showed up when you made a mistake. And particularly when we were, learning about the online space, and many people were so afraid of what are we going to do if we make a mistake. I said, for me, some of the biggest learning lessons I took was watching you handle those fumbles, those obstacles, those challenges in the online space, and recognizing, hey, if you're going to do it and you can show up and you can laugh at yourself and you can enjoy those failing forward moments, then I can do the same myself. And that's what I really believe is a philosophy we should take throughout all training and facilitation of workshops.
Which really relates to the confidence that you can, and maybe also giving ourselves permission, related to what you said earlier, that before you had all the burden of I need to know it, and maybe I need to be this specific person, because that's how my imagination of what a trainer shall look like or act like. And actually, from what I hear, it's by doing less, we're actually giving more. So we can just be ourselves. It's the easiest way to be and to do. And that's good enough. And actually, even more than that. Right?
It's so true. And one of my incredible mentors, who unfortunately has passed away, he has a phrase that really stuck with me, which is from nervous to service. And what it really, it's a mantra sometimes, that when I even still, sometimes if I ever find myself of getting anxious or something is happening about, oh, am I prepared? Am I this? I always say, where's the focus here? Is it on me and my nervousness, my anxiety, my stress, my uncomfort, or am I able to focus more on the service I'm able to provide for these learners? Because that's where the focus needs to be. It's not about me, it's about them. And this is where, I use the term trainer for me, but this is where I feel, too many people think, okay, trainer is just someone who shares, who's just in that subject matter expert role, who's just sharing content. And for me, it's about to really be an effective trainer. And of course, facilitation is this, key aspect of this. It's that the focus is not on me. It has to be about the participants and the learners, and encouraging and empowering them to generate their own responses. And that's where the focus lies. And that's ultimately why we're doing all this, why it's so worth it to go through all those emotions for ourselves, because the focus needs to be on the learners and their learning experience.
Yeah. Jimbo Clark recently said something beautiful. He said that before a workshop, he really focused on the question, how can I fall in love with the participants?
I love that. And I've also heard, love your content, but love your participants more, right? We so much focus on what is it I want to say? What is it I want to do? What are these activities? And we need to stop and actually take a moment and say, wait a second, is this what this group needs? Is this what this group wants? And how do we really put them in the center? And that's another aspect which we probably can have a whole nother podcast episode about, is, really taking the concepts of human-centered design and putting that in the training and facilitation space. Because I recently actually had an amazing experience. It was my first in-person training after so long of COVID. And really, I said the key thing here needs to be about psychological safety, but so much, it was so connected with that human-centered design piece. How are we actually, every single day we were revising the training outline and curriculum for the next day, and participants were shocked, like, wow, you really are listening to us. You heard that we want this, and now we've come today saying we're going to do something totally different than what was originally in the plan based on what you need. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that taking that approach, I've never heard so many people say in a training environment, I feel so safe here. I heard that almost every single day from different people. I feel so safe here because at the end of the day, all people want, it's a human basic need. All they want is to be seen and heard. And if we are not flexible and adaptable to their needs, they don't feel seen and heard. And that further continues for them to feel, I can't show up in this space. I'm not even going to voice my concerns. I'm not even going to, it's not worth the effort. So they really do go hand in hand, I think.
I love that. Totally. And you mentioned that the design process of building the psychological safety starts way ahead of the session. So what are you practically doing to nurture this?
Great question. So I think we, as we design workshops, we often are so much in that workshop space, and we think, okay, what's going to happen from the moment participants walk in or click into the workshop to out. But you're right, we have to consider these bookends, what happens before and after. Particularly in the online space, what I found is so important is sending out preparation information, whether it's an email, booklet, just even helping people know what they can expect. Because you have an idea, maybe they signed up for your workshop on X topic and you have an idea what you're going to be doing, but for so many people, I've learned that if they don't know what to expect, they may not be in that right state of mind to really be able to show up and be present. And so what I really find essential in the online space is to send emails, and that I'm now doing it even more for in-person, where it's something I didn't used to do, which is, hey, here's what you can expect. Here's how we want you to show up. So many people, we've all been, in Zoom for years now, but everyone is using that space differently. And so people may say, I'm going to come in here and show up. And, I'm where I work, we don't use the chat. I don't unmute. I'm here to consume information from you. Wait. This is an experience, at least for me, I would say this is an experiential learning workshop. This is not a webinar. This is not one directional. Please come prepared to speak up, to share in small groups, to share in chat, to voice your own concerns and opinions. You have to set the stage. And that's actually something that Amy Edmondson, who's one of, I believe the top world researcher on psychological safety, she says, this is what you have to do before you can invite participation. You have to set the stage, and people have to understand what is it that they're going to expect to get involved in. And also, even, there's so many things you can do to set the stage, even at the beginning of a workshop, is also when people are coming in, right? Nobody wants to show up to a quiet room, for in-person. Everything is quiet. People feel uncomfortable, not sure. It's like, okay, we'll get started in a minute. People are all sitting in a circle, very quiet. No one's talking. And then, okay, now welcome, right? That's not natural. Usually we want to be setting that stage where people feel comfortable from the moment they walk in. There's music playing. Maybe there's already a connecting activity on their chairs. Like, while we wait, here's some connecting cards and questions, like start to talk to the different participants and get to know each other even before we start. The same thing in the online space. Welcome them with music, have an activity as people are trickling in, because it doesn't make people feel safe or encouraging to be in that quiet, awkward, uncomfortable room, right?
True, because silence can be very nurturing if we feel safe. But awkward silence is just, then we don't know what to do. We don't know our role, what to act. Very true. And you said one thing that I haven't even considered before. I think you mentioned the Zoom room and how it's usually, what is our habit of using this? And I never even thought about that. So if we walk into a physical space, the space has history or no history. So if it's an offsite, maybe it's new, and then we can start from a fresh page, which is great. If it's a workshop space in the office, this space has history. Then Zoom also has history. And I've never even have considered that if a group or a participant has bad memories, maybe some trauma in air quotes, of using a specific tool, then there is also a mental shift we need to prepare them for.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, now we've been doing it for a few years that people feel, oh, we're comfortable. We know we don't need to send those emails. People already know how the technology works. One, it's about so much more than the technology. It's about how we're using that space. And I love what you said, the space has history. It's so true. And, but on the other side, we cannot forget that their fear of technology is a huge barrier to safety, right? And so I would often see at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of facilitators and trainers say, okay, we're using this platform and this new platform and this new tech and this thing. And okay, we cannot forget that for many people, if it's not something, you know, even if it's not Zoom, maybe, you know, but we don't know. Maybe some people haven't been using Zoom because they've been using a different platform. And so to come in and use a new technological app can also be such a source of discomfort and I don't know what I'm doing. And you're right, can bring up some kind of really unpleasant emotional experiences they're walking in the room. And so that's why I always really believe that it's important to set that stage before they come in, but also at the start of any workshop. It's about, let's make sure that people understand, here's how we're going to engage. I always say, like, make the engagement explicit. Make it really set the stage and help people see, here's how we want you to engage and interact in this space. And I always love to use, you know, different principles. Like in the online space, I always say cameos are cool, right? You can bring your kids, your partners, your roommates, who knows, all are welcome, because that's another big fear people have of, hey, it's not just the space in Zoom, but hey, you're getting a window into my personal space, which for some people can be really uncomfortable of, okay, I have people walking in and out. And so people would rather have their cameras off the whole time than to show up vulnerably like that, right? So I always say, okay, let's just be mindful. Cameos are cool. Bring people in, no problem. Or I'll say, you know, let's all embrace this concept of failing forward. Technological issues are bound to happen. They can happen on your side. They can happen on my side. No one needs to apologize for their Wi-Fi. How many times we hear, I'm so sorry, my internet went. You don't need to apologize. This is not something in your control. This is the new normal, and we need to create those conditions that people feel, I can show up and I can be me and I can belong, and, you know, no matter what all those obstacles we may be facing together are.
I love that. The no need to apologize. It's so true. It's so true. We always feel bad and it's not in our hands. And then it occupies our mind and takes away headspace that we would actually want the participants to put into the content.
Exactly. And from different things like that, you know, it's amazing to see the impact. So one is that, you know, when you really, you know, set the stage that way and make it clear from the beginning that participants should also hold each other accountable in that space. So for that example about apologizing, like the more you normalize that behavior, of not apologizing for tech or Wi-Fi or internet issues, then I start to see participants telling each other, right? Even sometimes we pop into breakout rooms and someone's like, oh, it took me forever to get here. So sorry, my internet went out, I'm back. And people say, hey, remember, we don't need to apologize. Don't worry. And I start to see that participants actually show up more compassionately to each other and with more empathy, because we've started to create that space without saying this is a safe space, right? Without saying all these things. Or the cameos are cool aspect. I had a mother, she had, you know, just had a newborn baby and she was breastfeeding, and, you know, or then she had her baby around it, but her video was off the whole time. And, you know, when I said that, she said, wow. She turned on her video and she said, I want you to know this is the first time in a year and a half that I've ever turned my video on an online call. I said, what? And she said, it's been so crazy having a baby who's like toddler, you know, it's running all these things are running around, and I'm so afraid of them making noise, and try not to unmute myself or talk too much because I don't want to distract others. And I said, no, this is a beautiful way for you also to role model for other mothers, right? Mothers are the superheroes of the pandemic. You're juggling kids, you're juggling work. Congratulations for being here and taking that initiative, for wanting to learn. We want to reward you and celebrate you, and you know, flex to your needs right now. And so if you feel more comfortable at certain times to go off camera, you know, you're welcome to, but no worries, bring that baby here, rock that baby to sleep on camera. It's beautiful to see. And that was a really powerful lesson for me as well, in how we're creating those safe spaces.
Thank you for this example. So powerful. And yeah, it makes so much sense. And I was just thinking that the dynamic we bring into the space through an apology is we're diminishing ourselves, we're making ourselves small. And at the same time, the other person would then say, oh, either get annoyed. And I think it's a dynamic that creates, if I apologize, I make myself small, how does the other person react? Either by being, oh, again, so kind of annoyance, or, oh, that's okay. So a bit this paternalistic kind of role, but it's very difficult to meet each other at the same level and to just be, as you described, compassionate with each other when one starts to apologize. I haven't thought of that before.
And I think this is one of the benefits I think I have from just years of experience in training on emotional intelligence, is that it's a key skill, and it's an umbrella skill, because there's so many skills underneath there that I think all facilitators and all trainers have to have. We have to show up with empathy and really observe and understand what's happening with the group, what's happening with each individual, and show up with compassion and respect. And it can often happen, particularly when you have difficult, right? It's easy to say when you have great participants, but when you have difficult and challenging participants, in the past, I used to always create some kind of backstory, or just, think maybe the worst, like, oh, this person is so critical and so not here to learn. And, it's disrupting the group. And, I've had to learn over the years, everyone has a story. You have no idea what that person may have been going through that day. And how can we show up with more kindness and compassion, and maybe take that person aside in person, or, ask, find ways to interact with them even online, and, really try to better understand what's happening for that person and how you can make it the most impactful learning experience for them, no matter what they may be going through.
And it was as if you read my mind. I was going to also go in that direction of how do we deal with the situations that are challenging. And two things come to my mind. One is, how do we learn this emotional intelligence to show up that way? And where can it break? Because yes, we're setting the stage, we're explaining the rules of the game, and then someone might break the rules. Yes, they do have a story, but with their behavior, they can put the entire group at risk. So how do you deal with these situations to de-escalate or to voice them or not?
Yeah, so going back to that the leader's toolkit from Amy Edmondson was right. You need to set the stage. You need to then invite participation and really encourage, right, again, that people are really owning that space. But then you also have to respond productively, she says, right? And that means equally when those difficult situations occur, and if someone breaks those rules, right, usually at the beginning of any kind of long workshop, we're co-creating agreements, creating a contract with a group. Okay, and then we want to hold each other accountable to that. If someone breaks those quote unquote rules or agreements, is probably a better word, we need to hold them accountable, but hold them accountable in a again, a safe and kind way. Because I think, you can create the space, you can set the stage and create the space, but if you don't live into these values, people see it and it's like, oh, you were just saying this to say this, but you don't really care. And so what I'm learning to do more of when I see that happen is call it out, but call it out in a way of saying, wait, let's pause for a moment. There was a beautiful learning moment that just happened here. And then let's look at what just happened as a group, right? And then it's no longer about the person and what that person did. It's about the behavior and how we can all work at it as a group and say, I want to call it out, but for us to learn, not for us to punish a participant, but for us to learn from this, because this could have happened to anyone else, right? For example, I've had, I'll use the most basic one when we're meeting with a group and we make a community agreement about being on time and respecting each other's time. When I've worked with international groups, every culture has a completely different understanding of time and what does it actually mean to be late or on time. For example, I've spent many years living in Spain. Nobody even calls somebody until after 30 minutes to say, I think I'm going to be late now. After 30 minutes is when they tell, like, okay, I'm officially late. Whereas when I've lived in Germany, you're late if you show up on time because everyone is there 10 minutes early, expecting you to be early. So we all have different understandings of time. And so if we say, hey, we want to respect each other's time and show up on time, it's inevitable that someone may show up late or may consistently show up late. And if we don't call those out and we don't, as Amy Edmondson says, if we don't respond productively, it starts to spread and it sends an implicit message to the group that that behavior is okay. And therefore we're not holding up our agreements. Therefore, anything we wrote there is also, there's wiggle room and flexible room, and we don't have to uphold any of those agreements. So I try and really use all of those moments as teachable moments for myself, for the group, and say, hey, a participant comes in 20 minutes late. Come here and let's talk about this. Like, hey, it's not about you showing up late. It's like, hey, this is a great learning experience. I often, if it's consistent, I would say if someone shows up late once, I also, again, try and give them grace. Like, I don't know what happened in their day. And so I'll take them aside at some point, again, privately. I think it's important, and not from the group, and just say, hey, everything okay? I noticed you showed up late and remember our agreements, just wanted to check in. And that person, it's again, that person doesn't feel punished, but sees and feels that you're showing up with trying to understand and showing up with curiosity more. But if it becomes a consistent thing, then we bring it to the group and we say, hey, we noticed this is happening. I noticed many people are showing up late and we're not upholding the group. How does that make you feel? How does it, what's the impact? Because I also used to be somebody who just personally, I was always showing up late for things because my time management is not always the best. And it took a good friend of mine saying, hey, every time you show up late, you're sending a message to me that your time is more valuable than mine. And I went, oh, okay, that's never the message I intended to send. It was just because I, was not always great with time. But now I'm really, because of that and understanding the feelings and the impact on that person, I'm now trying so hard to be more intentional about being on time. So yeah, I think creating learning moments, remembering the feelings, bringing all that into the space can really make a difference.
What a good friend.
Yes,
I think
right?
it's so important to have these friends who call us out in a compassionate way and remind us. What I hear is that the underlying thinking is nobody does it on purpose. So if someone breaks the agreement, first let's assume that there's a story to that, try to understand the story, and then we focus on the agreements. And you said that you co-create them in the beginning. How can I imagine that? Are you bringing the basics to the space and then ask them to agree or to add, or do you really start from scratch?
So I use it. What I typically do I'm thinking now more in person. Sometimes it's harder to do this online, but I still have done this in a different way in the online space as well. Is that, I hear a lot of facilitators saying, okay, we have to start with the agreements, right? We welcome everyone. We're saying maybe we do a little get to know each other, but let's go into the agreements. And again, you need to make sure that people feel safe to actually contribute agreements that they really need. So what I often do is I start any day of a longer training or any chunk of time, if it's a one-day training, to really use that experiential learning cycle. That's the foundation of my work is on experiential learning. So I create an experience for them, usually as a team. We'd have some kind of team challenge. So it's some crazy things sometimes, from how do we get the whole group to get over here or there with objects, and how do we, it can be crazy things. It could also just be, Anything that's really a challenge for a team that they have to work together. I really try and create those kind of experiences. Then we would go into the reflecting space of the cycle. And that's really like, hey, let's debrief what just happened. So one aspect is always, did you reach your goal as a team? That's one thing. But actually what I care more about is the process of how we work together and really starting to reflect and debrief more. And then that brings us to the thinking phase, where sometimes I may introduce some content there a little bit. This is right, thinking about that subject matter expert role. And it may be a small introduction of content, maybe about psychological safety, how Google found it is the #1 key differentiator for teams, for high-performing teams, and what it actually means. Could also just be, continuing to help them, process what happened in that experience, and taking an outward lens of saying, wait a second, let's look at how this could actually occur in the greater context of this training. But then we have the acting space. And so the acting space is where we need to actually put into practice what we've learned through the process. And that's really where I love to bring in those community agreements. So now that we've reflected on how we work together as a team, what we did well, what we didn't do well, what we know, what we need to, we need to really build that space for psychological safety. So what do you think we can actually do now? And I often try and give participants, particularly to think about introverts, I try to give everyone, time to think about it first for themselves, not go straight into the group brainstorm, because you often hear the same voices. Extroverts like myself, we're the first ones to be speaking, but we don't hear all the voices in the room. So I like to, pass out Post-its, or even just if I'm in online space, have everyone write down on their own piece of paper, and maybe with a little music, just think for a little bit about, what do you need from the others? What do you need from this group to truly show up authentically in this space, to truly feel that this is a team, that this is a learning space that you feel that you can show up, and that, be able to voice that. And we'll collect everyone's, and we'll use that to create agreements. And we'll say, I go through and make sure I get thumbs up from everyone. I said, this is also the, psychological safety. It's not just touchy-feely, okay, good. It's also about creating that space for debates to happen. And I said, hey, some person may put this here, but someone else may say, hey, I don't want that agreement in. I don't agree with that. Phones, for example, can be a big thing about, like, how do we use the phone? And having those conversations and debates, and being able to say every single point here on that contract is something that we all have agreed upon to be there, helps everyone take more ownership over it. So I do start from scratch, but then I'll notice some things that might be missing. And then I pose it as a group. I can never impose agreements and say, this is what you need to do in the space. I'll say, what do you think about this? How should we approach this? What do you think? And introduce it more as from a space of curiosity, and see how the group decides to agree on those points.
And it's funny, I had this, while listening, I was, in my mind, I had this debate whether, this is taking a lot of time. But at the same time, the way you framed it and approach it, it becomes almost like a separate chunk of content and learning. So it's almost, so yes, you're spending all this time on the agreements that might be usually labeled as just a checkbox on the agenda. Okay, 5 minutes for that. But the way how you create it, if I understand it correctly, it becomes part of the journey. And then you can always refer back to.
Yes, exactly. It's about making it part of the learning agreement. Making these learning agreements part of the learning experience. And otherwise, right, if we're just saying, let's just go for some agreements just to go for it, no one cares, no one takes ownership. But by grounding those agreements in that team building experience, in that team building discussion, in that content that you're introducing, now it's something that we all understand the why. And I think that's often something we need to do more of as facilitators, is help introduce things from the why, because sometimes we just say, this is the what. We need to make agreements, so let's make agreements. But if people don't really understand why it's important, or ground it in that whole experience, it's really hard to encourage them to take ownership. And you're right, like, these things take time. And I get from clients, I'll often get a lot of pushback of, hey, we're here to talk about leadership, or we're here to talk about, you know, any other topic, who doesn't matter, but why are we spending so much time here on this team part, on this getting to know each other, on introducing? I said, you have to go slow to go far, you know, and to go fast eventually. Because if you don't take a good chunk of time to, you know, it's again part of setting that stage. If you don't take enough time to help participants connect with one another, to feel like they're part of a team, to, you know, agree and discuss how they want to work together, it's very difficult to get, you know, full active engagement and participation later on in the training when you're talking about leadership, if all of that hasn't been established. Because again, psychological safety is the foundation for learning. And people are not, you know, it's, as we said before, it's vulnerable to say, I don't know. It's vulnerable to brainstorm. It's vulnerable to share your crazy, wild thoughts or your personal experiences for whatever the content is that you're sharing. You need to go slow and take that time to really establish that foundation so that later the learning experience is so much more impactful.
Yeah. And if these ground rules and shared agreements is not leadership, is not modeling leadership.
Exactly.
What is? Yeah.
Precisely.
What is your number one facilitation challenge?
Probably the time one. I'm still working on it. I think, you know, I see this happening to a lot of clients, that it's people want to throw in so much content, and I keep saying we don't have enough time for the content. But it goes the same way for the experiences, right? I, on the other hand, am more about creating the experience, and I'm like, oh, we could do this, and we could do this, and we could do this, and I always trying to put more into the workshops. And then I realize, wait a second, Romy, this is not, you can't do all of this. And luckily, I'd say that one of my facilitation strengths is my flexibility and adaptability, so that, you know, halfway through the workshop, when I see, oh, like maybe I had 10 ideas of what I wanted to do in today's, you know, workshop, and then realize, oops, we're probably only going to get to 5 of them, but that's okay. And then I shift, you know, the time, and that's, you know, luckily most participants never even know. That's another thing. As a facilitator, don't tell the participants, oh, we don't have time, or oh, I've had all these other things planned. They don't know. Help them create the learning experience so that you don't want them to feel that they're missing out on anything. But it's one thing that I always am trying to improve is remembering that it takes, you know, there always needs to be time for that wiggle room. And there needs to be time for that experience to unfold in whatever way or shape or form the participants want. Because if you're for me, because I follow experiential learning theory, when we get to that reflecting space, that debrief space, you never know what topics may come up and may set participants on a tangent and say, oh, let's actually explore this. This is something I want to go into. And it happens often. I say, okay, like, you know, in my mind, I know I had something totally else planned, but you never know what participants are going to bring up in those debriefs. So let's actually go in a different way. And here's a different topic. And here's a different experience we're actually going to create from those beautiful insights that popped up. But without enough time and space to let that unfold, you know, that becomes a big hindrance. So I'm working on that, as well as always going back and reminding myself on the learning goals and objectives. I can say, I want to do all these things, but what are those key essential things that I know I need to do in order to achieve those objectives? And so I usually in my plans have like stars or highlights or colors to know which ones are the non-negotiables that I need to find time for, and which ones are the fluffy ones that if we have time might be great to add in there as well to further the learning.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, I was thinking of maybe it was Warren Buffett who said, make a list of everything you want to do, then prioritize, look at the first 5 and all the rest, put them on to avoid at all cost list. Because these are actually the time wasters or the distractors that will keep you away from your priorities. And I was just thinking that actually for learning content, it might be similar. So we have this abundance of knowledge that we want to transfer to the group because we care so much for our topic. But then if we are trying to throw too much content at them, they won't remember anything because the experience and the depth are missing. So I was just wondering, maybe it's important to have this priority and then to strictly avoid all the little parts that we would wish to share, but they're actually putting the learning at risk.
Yes, such a great point. I think that's part of why I have to like be strict on the chopping block even sometimes before we even get there, because if I say, oh, I might do this, no, I don't even want to open up the avenue to get us off track, because I know that's a big time waster. So you're so right that we need to really be able to prioritize what are the key aspects and how we can, let's say, what I try to do and remember for myself is that this doesn't have to be the end all be all, right? A lot of people think, okay, if it's a workshop on leadership is a huge topic. There is no way that everyone's going to learn everything they need to learn about leadership in a 1 hour workshop, in a half-day workshop, even in a 1 week workshop on leadership. It really doesn't matter. It's about you as the facilitator understanding what are those key aspects I want to focus on. That's why those learning objectives, I think, come in hand. For me, it's so important. And I know that when I first started training facilitating, I didn't take enough time to really craft those learning objectives and get really specific, because I have to know what aspect, even on psychological safety, right? What are the key things I want to make sure that my participants walk away from understanding about psychological safety, and how do I design around that? For me, it's all about the time of the experience, but you're so right. For so many people, I see them struggling with this content, but I have too much content I need to give. And I said, but what's the point of sharing all that content if, as you said, our brains are not wired to learn from just constant direct presentation, for so long? No one will remember it. So isn't it more valuable to take out of all that content you want to share, take 1 or 2 things and design experiences around it? Because that's what's going to stick in that long-term memory, is the experience, the emotions, the discussions that came up from participants. Actually, participants remember more what they hear from their peers and their colleagues than what they learn from the trainer and facilitator. And so we forget that. And so that's what really sticks for people. And so we have to create spaces that they're sharing and discussing with each other. And then we bring in the content as a way to cement all of those experiences, but not as I'm here to share knowledge and impart knowledge with you, because none of that is going to stick, as you said.
It's so interesting what you're saying, that participants remember more the content shared by their by their peers. And it circles back to what you said in the beginning, that if there's no safety and trust in the space, and I think especially if you're working with a team, they know each other, so they pay more attention and they listen more openly. Whereas with a new trainer, they first have to, okay, can I actually trust this person? Is it actually really an expert? Isn't it maybe a lemon? So it's good to keep that in mind, because this means that we actually have to reinforce the bits of content we really want to transfer. And I wonder whether then, also what you said before, to make it about them and not about us. So yes, we want to share all of our knowledge. Are we really want to share it for them, or do we just want to show off of how much we know? And I think that's a very maybe daring question to ask ourselves, to be fully honest, because I think very often we also enjoy showing off a bit with all we know, and we get excited and then we want to share this excitement, but it's then about us.
So true. And that brings me back to from nervous to service, right? And I see that too much. And I was guilty of this, right? When I was starting, was I need to show my expertise. I need to show it. And then I would start, talking. At the end of the day, I always remember Maya Angelou's quote, which really connects me to all the learning experience, right? At the end of the day, people will not remember what you said or what you did, but they remember how you made them feel. And so anytime I'm coming at it from a place of I want to share or show from me, I say, wait a second, how is that going to make people feel? They're probably going to feel bored if they hear so much. They're probably going to feel like, oh my gosh, this is too much. Oh, this woman is trying to share too much or show off, And so really reminding that people feel through those experiences, through those discussions, through those questions, through those reflections with their peers. And that's what I need to prioritize. We're talking about time and what needs to be on the chopping block. I too often see people say, because of the time issue, we need to take out those icebreakers, those connecting activities, taking time to set the stage. Whereas when you take those out, you do your entire learning experience a disservice, because people will not remember just the content.
Yeah. And you disrespect or disregard the basic human need of first create connection, of landing in the space, acknowledging that something has happened before they stepped into the space and that they need this kind of mind shift as well.
And acknowledging their life experience, right? Too often, we see participants as empty cups that need to be filled, with information, with knowledge. But I have to remember that every single person there is actually a full cup with life experience that you want to drink from and draw from as a facilitator. We need to be prioritizing that aspect instead of this knowledge deposits in their brain.
Like a goose.
Yeah. Exactly.
I love the image of the full cup. And then would you then also consider or think of how can we actually remove content from their cups so that they actually have capacity to absorb more?
Yeah. And this is where, for me, the experiential learning cycle comes in, because having that framework, which, I know that the research and science shows that it allows for more long-term memory retention and more holistic learning and more self-awareness and discovery and workshops, right? I have to make sure I have all those 4 modes of the experiencing, reflecting. The thinking is usually where the content comes in, but that's 1 out of the 4 aspects that need to be there, as well as the acting piece, how they're going to bring it forward. And so really making sure that you're creating those balanced and holistic workshops that account for all those 4 modes. You see people being able to bring in more of their experience. And, the other aspect I always say is power of questions, right? This is the key. This is where we're stepping into that facilitator role in that training model, is being able to really draw from participants, ask them questions. I see far too often when we're in that subject matter expert role, it doesn't mean that we just need to be talking and sharing. I always try and start by asking the group a question. Before I'm going to be here and tell you what psychological safety is, I want to ask, what do you think it is? What are the first things that come to mind for you? Before I tell you why psychological safety is important, why do you think it's important? Human beings are meaning-making machines. Questions are such a simple yet so powerful tool that we can use for individuals to really start that critical thinking and meaning making in their own mind, that then they'll be more open and receptive to hearing your response, because they've had time to either think about it for themselves or even discuss with participants and hear more from them before you're there sharing that content. And I think we need to remember that is, again, I go back to what we said earlier, it's a partnership, and we need all of those areas involved.
Yeah. It almost sounds as if we first have to create curiosity to open up the mind, and then and maybe then not even more content into the cup is needed, but just a rewiring of what's already inside the cup. And I think that's also something that we often forget, that lots of the stuff that we are training is not rocket science. So it's something that everyone kind of knows intuitively. And then it's about bringing this forth and making everyone realize that, okay, you do have it inside of you. You just need to find new ways to access it and then to put it into practice.
So well said, Miriam. I think there's not enough curiosity happening in workshops, right? It seems very transactional, like you're speaking and sharing, or I'm speaking and sharing, but how do we embed curiosity to learn more from our participants? I'm there as a trainer facilitator, but I always feel I learned so much more from my participants than even I think that they learn from me, although they never say that. But I think that it's so important to be able to drink from everyone's cup and to create a space where everyone feels they can share their life experience, they can share their full cups of life experience or knowledge or background in that topic, whether or not they realize it, or not. And also create the space that they show up with curiosity about their peers, about what others have experienced. Those are so essential.
Yeah. And one thing I'm curious about, because I recorded a conversation with Susanna, and we discussed about the role of play. And she mentioned that when she works with corporates, she stopped calling it play, but she would call it an experience or find different terms, because just the word play already puts someone off, because there's so much history and baggage. And I was wondering what your approach to concepts like safety and vulnerability are, because you mentioned it before that vulnerability is still often considered as a weakness. And I can imagine that when you walk in and say, okay, let's talk about psychological safety, everyone goes like, oh, here we go again.
It's very mixed. I'd say now, I don't, if for good or bad, I'm not sure. Psychological safety is a big buzzword these days. So many people say, oh, okay, there's a lot of, oh, psychological safety. Yes, I want, but it's more, I see too many people see it as a checklist. Like, okay, we do it, we're done, it's check. But you're right. For other people, it can be extremely off-putting. Of we're going to be here and talk about emotions in this professional setting. Emotions should be compartmentalized for after work. They don't belong in the workplace. Luckily, I think with the pandemic and everything, it really helps shine a light on mental health and emotional health, and how much that does so much impact our workplaces, whether we're willing to admit it or not. So I think, again, sorry to keep going back to this, but again, I think it's about people need to experience it first to believe it, right? So I personally will not put my name on any kind of direct lecture or presentation. I've had people, companies say, can you please come in and give us a 1-hour webinar on psychological safety? And I say, no, I'm sorry, I don't do that, because it's also for you, the return on investment on what people are actually going to learn from this or do from this is not going to be the same if I create a truly experiential workshop around psychological safety. And people have to really experience it to be able to understand why that vulnerability matters. And so, for example, one of my favorite activities to start that connection before content aspect and bringing people together it's a very simple one. But I've had a lot of success with this, particularly in corporate environments where people might be less willing to talk about these topics. It's an activity called Who Are You? Right? So often, as you said, the group knows each other and they've met each other and worked together for many years, but do they really know the person behind that screen or behind the desk in the office? So in the online space, what I would do is start the workshop, after saying, hey, I'm here, and do a little bit of setting the stage is, okay, we're going to dive in and just get to know each other a little bit more first. So I would put them in breakout rooms of like kind of speed dating style with either 2 people in a room, maybe 3 people. And their task was to share who are they in as many identifiers as possible that have to do outside of work, right? We all know what you do at work, but what are those identifiers? So I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a art lover, I'm a foodie, anything that comes to mind in terms of identifiers about you. Then they come back to the main room and then we reflect, okay, how was that? Okay, we got some things. Now we're going to do it again. You're going to be in new groups, new people, but same things. And you cannot share anything you shared in the first round, right? So then people start getting a little bit deeper and it's like, ooh, I'm a philosophy fanatic, or I'm a firm believer in, I don't know, mental health, or things start to come up. Okay, then they come back to the main room. And then if you really want to make it more challenging, they go for a third round with new people. And again, they cannot say anything that they shared before. And what you start to see is that they've actually experienced for themselves a deeper dive into vulnerability, because you have those surface things, but then by the time they're at that third round, it's things that they've never, ever shared with their colleagues, things that people would never know, things that, probably feels quite vulnerable to share with colleagues. And we have a debrief on that. Miriam, I cannot tell you how many groups I worked with that said, just in that 10-minute, could be 15-minute activity, depending on time, how much people get from that. And that is from the very beginning of a workshop. People say, wow, I just had a huge aha moment that we don't take enough time to connect about things outside of work in this group. I learned so much about my colleagues that I never had. I have chills actually here thinking about all of those beautiful responses that come up from that. And that's then how we start going into using that as a grounding group exercise in vulnerability, without saying, be vulnerable, it's about, what did you notice? And then we draw out the responses and start talking about how, yes, it might have felt very uncomfortable. Some people say, I had to resort to something I already said because I didn't have enough. And then it can even be a self-exploration exercise of, wow, I didn't have enough things. I also want to be able to learn more about myself and what are those identifiers. And so much can come out from that, but it's a beautiful example for the group to experience the power of vulnerability and creating that space for psychological safety.
Thank you for sharing this activity.
Yeah,
I will try that out. And I can totally see the value of this activity for a team, even on a different level, because it allows them in the future to bring their full self into work, and to also acknowledge that maybe something that is underlying surface might be helpful for the teamwork. So if you're working on a task and then you just learned that someone is actually a hobby designer or artist, you can ask them for something you wouldn't have even considered before if it relates, or someone who loves to solve riddles or mathematical problems, I don't know, making this up. But then you can also connect on a different level, on a everyday kind of working routine.
Precisely. From that little exercise, you don't even need to give people so much time in those breakouts. Sometimes I say you have 1 minute per person to just list off as many, things as possible. But from that, people get so much that they come back and say, we've already set up a call to discuss more about this because we didn't know that we had this in common, or this was so totally different and diverse perspectives on something that we can't wait to, set up another call and just have a virtual coffee and get to know each other more. And you're so right. The benefits of being able to connect people more at work, but then leverage those beautiful differences and unique qualities and bring that into the workplace are too often overlooked. And that's why I really believe in the connection before content. That's why I believe in creating spaces that people can show up and, bring them full selves and all of that background in, because the benefits, even for work, it's tenfold, really.
Yeah. In your understanding, what makes a workshop fail?
I think so much of what we've already talked about is not having that psychological thing, not taking the time to invest in bringing those groups together, in taking more of the sage on the stage approach instead of an experiential learning approach. Not providing participants with enough time to share their own opinions and trying to, deposit knowledge, content in their minds. All of that comes together for a really it's actually oppression in learning, and we don't talk enough about this. I did a big certification for 2 years on Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed and how oppression comes in learning. And it's, one aspect, of course, is diversity and inclusion. We need to think about that always. That's one of the key pillars of psychological safety is diversity and inclusion. But also the way that we actually implement our workshops can be done in a very oppressive way if the focus is on me and not on we, or if the focus is on me giving you content and not creating enough space for you to reflect on that content, to share your own examples, to have experiences. It's that's what I really hope to do with all my experiential workshops is, avoid that oppression. Even when you look at the school, right? So unfortunately, when we think about schools, there's always the teacher standing up at the front of the room and all the desks and all the students sitting down in rows. And that space, right? We're here to talk about this, creating a space. All of the spaces, even in terms of how the rooms are laid out, send a message to us about how we can show up in this space. When you look at those classroom environments, it sends a message that I'm at the front of the room because I am the knowledgeable one here, and you all have to learn from me, and not that we're all going to be learning from each other. There was a period of time where I was actually an English teacher in Spain. Of course, I was never really teaching on English, but always about personal development topics in English to improve their English skills. But my students knew that I was the weird teacher that every time before my class, they all had to move all the desks out to the side and rearrange the chairs in a circle, because that sends a message there that we're all equal. I'm sitting down. We're all at the same level. I'm here to do this, to learn from you and with you. And yes, I get that in the online space, it's a bit different, but still, you send a message also by the way you role model. So also, I can never, ever, ever ask my participants to do something that I'm not willing to do myself, ever. And I need to also show that and be that example, particularly if we're talking about very vulnerable topics. For example, this "who are you" activity. I have to first give an example, and I'm going to be listing off tons of identifiers about myself so people see, oh, okay, she did it. Now I feel more comfortable. We can do it. And we need to think more about all those, very subtle but very significant messages that are sent about the space and how people can interact, and the power dynamics that exist in these workshops.
Yeah, and how we absorb then the knowledge. I cannot let go of the picture with the glass.
It's a good one, I know.
Yes, and what came up for me is like, when you explained how we just trying to put more and more content in this glass and then it's overflowing. But through the experiential cycle, as you explained it, the goal is actually to condense the knowledge so that so we don't have to take stuff out. No, we have to condense it, and we condense it through sharing. So if we're just offloading our knowledge and we don't give space for them to share, because the sharing is our way of condensing, of reflecting, of making sense making. Yeah. So then we can condense and then add a little bit new.
If we take this visual even more, I see it more as, everyone in the room is that full cup, and my job is actually to hold an empty jug and have a space that everyone is pouring a little bit from all of their cups, and together we have a much bigger jug that's full, colorful, different kinds of drinks and all these things that are there that can be, much more delicious to drink from.
I love that. If someone is now intrigued about this entire concept of experiential learning, but well, everyone can always take a course, but maybe there's something that they can do already now to be a little bit more intentionally experiential in their facilitation style. What would you advise as a first step or as a start?
Well, obviously take a course with me. But but I think, there's tons of amazing resources and things out there, but I think it's in the most basic, simple terms. I just think it's about looking at your workshop design before before you implement it. And when you're designing your workshop, design it the way you typically would, maybe without thinking about these things, and then go back and look at where the experiences. And an experience is what David Kolb says is something that strikes the learner. It taps into our emotions, it taps into our five senses. It's something new, but it really tries to strike them. For example, that, who are you activity, I would say, is an experience. Then look at where are those reflection points? Where is there open space to debrief and not say, any questions or, what did you learn? But really trying to take them through a process of like, how was that for you? Or if it's a very emotional or deeper experience, how do you feel right now? Let's really create space for more reflecting in that workshop, and then drawing from, what happened? What did you notice? What came up for you? Really trying to be as we said, coming from a place of curiosity, because the beauty of experiential workshops is that everyone can have the exact same experience, but take away completely different learning outcomes. And we need to create space to drink from all those cups, to hear all those different diverse perspectives on what happened for them. And then I look at my workshop and say, okay, where's the thinking part? Where am I, delivering content? And what is that difference in terms of time and effort, not effort, but time, in terms of how much of this is more content and in the thinking space, and how much of this is more in the experiencing or reflecting space. And last but not least is acting. I see this far too often missing from workshops. Is like, okay, maybe we have an experience, maybe reflect on it, and maybe I share with you knowledge. Okay, any questions? Okay, thanks so much. Q&A. Okay, bye. Thank you so much for being here. Participants need to know, how are they going to, what are they going to do after that workshop or that training? How are they going to move forward and take those learnings and put them into practice? And that is so often too missing. But we need to also think about, behavior change. We need to think about, how are we creating the conditions that people are creating some kind of action plan for themselves, or are taking away some kind of artifact that they have in their space that they will remember all those learning outcomes. Or, they need to know what at least is that first step, right? You can say, okay, I want to learn more about psychological safety, but what's that one step that you can actively do? Okay, I want to, research more or read Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organization, whatever it is. Make sure you have at least one action step forward so people know what they're going to do when that workshop ends, so they can put their learning into practice. And so for me, my advice for any facilitator is look at your designs and look to see, first of all, are all those 4 modes of the cycle in there? And are they balanced? Or is it completely out of whack balance, that there's so much thinking and very little experiencing, reflecting, and acting? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be equal time on each, but there needs to be some kind of balance there.
Thank you. It reminds me of, when I design my workshops, I use Session Lab, and there's a color code, right, for activities. And I usually use a color code like content or theory. So what is one direction or instructions? What are small group exercises? What are debriefs? And now, after listening to you, I want to change that to have color codes for the 4 different phases, because then you also have a visual overview of, are you actually allocating sufficient time to the experience, to the action, to the reflection, the learning. Exactly. Experiment with that.
Yes, do let me know how that goes. I would love to hear how, like, for me, that's key. That's the start for that, but then there's, all the other layers, right? And then, as you said, it's about diversifying, right? So are all these, in all these 4 modes of the cycle, is there so much group discussion? Because that gets boring. We need to make sure it's, dynamic. And so when are we in small groups? When are we in large groups? When are we in medium-sized groups? When are we doing individual reflection activity, which is so important as well? And so then you can add all those like sprinkles on top.
Yeah. And remember that it doesn't need to be extremely techy or extremely complicated. Very often the best activity is just a question.
Oh, this for me is such a big topic, because I think when we move to the online space, we're all thinking now, so many facilitators were like, what are your favorite tech apps and tools? And it was all about that. And tools can help us, but they can also harm us in terms of our learning. And if we're just using technology just for the sake of, because we're in the online space, we should use technology, it does everyone a disservice, and we should be doing it only if it helps us reach our learning objectives. And so I find too often, remember, like, how people feel, we have to always think in all these phases, how are people going to be feeling in that space, because that's what they're going to remember. And if people are feeling, oh my gosh, there's too much tech, too much learning, I don't know, I feel uncomfortable, that can derail their learning experience. And so I always say in the online space, hey, don't forget, we can still get out some good old fashioned pen and paper. I want you to write down for yourself, write some notes first, or you can hold things up to the screen, right? You can create things, you can bring in objects. There's so much you can do that you don't need technology, besides, the actual platform of where you're meeting in the online space.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that we often forget to reflect on how we feel when we're new in the space. And I mean, I host a lot of workshops for facilitators and participate in many workshops with other facilitators. And it's always interesting to see how we would act differently and react if something is new, if we feel overwhelmed, if we feel uncertain of how to use technology. And I think it's so important for us in our own practice to put ourselves in these situations, to then create this real empathy with our participants, because we've been there.
So true. Emotions are contagious, right? And they really are contagious, and they're contagious even through the screen. So if you as a facilitator are feeling anxious or worried or stressed, that can spread to your whole group. And that's why I go back to what we said about role modeling vulnerability. And that's what psychological safety is all about. We need to be able to step into like our zone and be present and remember that we're having an impact in not just what we say, but so much more of what we do. When we think about actually the definitions of psychological safety, right? Timothy Clark says psychological safety is an environment of rewarded vulnerability versus punished. Yeah, right? Rewarded versus punished vulnerability. And so we need to be creating that space and that environment where you're role modeling your own vulnerability, but not freaking out and stressing out and making participants feel like, oh, this is really uncomfortable, but saying, hey, guess what, guys? I made a total tech error, and it's kind of funny. I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable, but I've had times where I say, but I feel this is a safe group, and I can admit that this was a mistake. Or, hey, I'm gonna laugh at myself about this, right? That sends such a more powerful message. But then people feel they can also make mistakes in the space, and
they don't have to apologize.
And they don't have to apologize. Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Romy.
Thank you, Miriam. I feel like we could be chatting for another hour or so. This was such a wonderful discussion, and so many different topics came up. But thank you so much for creating this safe space to actually dive deeper into all these different topics.
Thank you. And I will put your contacts into the show notes. So if someone wants to learn more, to become an experiential learning designer, they know which door to knock.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Dum, 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 dum. That's the end of my podcast jingle.